After everything Victoria and I do for you? You live here on our property, on our land, entirely rent-free, and you won't lift a single finger to help your own family? My God, Arthur, you are one profoundly selfish old man. He claimed I lived on his land. He had either conveniently forgotten or his blinding arrogance had obscured the truth. When I moved here 10 years ago, I didn't just buy the carriage house. I had purchased the entire 3-acre parcel of prime Austin real estate. His sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion was sitting on my land. His 99-year lease for a symbolic $1 a year was registered with me as the primary lessor. He was the tenant. I was the ground landlord. But he had no idea. Before I could speak, Julian slammed the bottle of scotch down onto my wooden coffee table with enough violent force to rattle the floorboards. "You'll regret this, old man," he snarled, his voice trembling with malicious rage. "You'll deeply regret being so incredibly selfish." He stormed out of the house, slamming the front door so hard that the framed photograph of Eleanor on my writing desk shook. The true depths of their depravity revealed themselves 48 hours later. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to a dull, heavy ache spreading across my chest, radiating with a cold numbness down my left arm. It wasn't the violent, crushing pain of an acute myocardial infarction, but rather the familiar, suffocating grip of severe, stress-induced angina. My cardiologist's words echoed in my mind. "Don't be a hero, Arthur. If the pain radiates, call for help immediately." My first instinct, born of an old-fashioned belief in family, was to call the main house. I dialed Victoria. The phone rang 4 times before she finally answered, her voice thick with sleep and heavy with immediate annoyance. "Dad? What is it? It's the middle of the night." "Victoria, honey, I'm not feeling right," I managed to say, keeping my breathing shallow to combat the tightening in my chest. "I'm having significant chest pains. It's likely an angina episode, but I need to go to the medical center just to be safe. Can you or Julian drive me?" A heavy, deeply resentful sigh came through the receiver. It was the distinct sound of profound inconvenience. "Dad, seriously? I have the executive committee meeting for the Children's Hospital Gala at 8 o'clock this morning. The entire board is coming to the house. I can't just abandon my responsibilities because you're having an anxiety attack. If it's actually that bad, call an ambulance. Stop overreacting." Click. She hung up. She didn't ask how severe the pain was. She didn't ask if I could breathe. She didn't care if I died in the dark as long as it didn't disrupt her social calendar. The ache in my chest tightened, but it wasn't from the angina anymore. It was from a profound, chilling realization. I didn't call an ambulance. I didn't want the flashing lights illuminating their driveway. Instead, I quietly called a rideshare service. I sat in the back of a modest hybrid sedan, clutching my chest in silence, while a complete stranger drove me to the emergency room of the Austin Medical Center. The doctors administered a nitroglycerin regimen and kept me under close observation for 5 hours. By 9 o'clock in the morning, my vitals had stabilized and I was officially discharged. I called another rideshare to take me back to the property. As the car pulled up to the massive, wrought iron security gates of the estate, I saw Victoria's pearl-white luxury SUV. It wasn't parked in the mansion's garage. It was parked outside an exclusive day spa in downtown Austin. While I was sitting alone in an emergency room cubicle with wires glued to my chest, my daughter was getting a facial for her charity meeting. They didn't just disrespect me. They didn't just view me as a financial asset to be exploited. They saw me as a nuisance, a tedious domestic problem to be managed, an errand to be ignored. And that was the exact moment I knew that the quiet, accommodating old man named Arthur Vance had to die. They thought they were dealing with a fading ghost. They had absolutely no idea they were about to declare war on the Lancet. The transition from a ghost to a predator does not happen with a scream. It happens with a quiet, icy clarity. I spent the rest of that day sitting in my armchair, watching the golden Texas sun sink behind the canyon walls. My mind operating with a mechanical precision I hadn't utilized in a decade. The definitive blow landed the following morning at precisely 10 o'clock. A sharp, impatient knock rattled my front door. It lacked Julian's arrogant cadence. This was a rhythmic, purely professional sound. I opened the door to a courier dressed in a crisp navy uniform, holding a digital signature pad and a heavy, legal-sized white envelope. "Arthur Vance?" the man asked, his face a mask of bureaucratic boredom. "Priority legal courier. Sign the screen, please." I pressed the stylus to the glass, my hand perfectly rigid, devoid of even the slightest tremor. He handed over the envelope and departed before the heavy oak door could even click back into its frame. I walked over to my mahogany writing desk, the one Eleanor had gifted me for our 20th anniversary, and picked up a solid silver letter opener. I slid it through the top of the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of high-grade bond paper. The words at the top of the primary page leaped out at me: cold, clinical, and devastating. In the District Court of Travis County, Texas, petition for emergency temporary guardianship and conservatorship. Petitioners: Julian Sterling and Victoria Sterling. Respondent: Arthur Vance. I scanned the legalese, my vision narrowing into a laser focus. They were requesting an emergency, closed-door hearing. They were formally accusing me of being mentally incapacitated, suffering from advanced cognitive decline, and exhibiting severe paranoid delusions regarding my family and my personal finances. They were claiming I was senile. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a legal execution. They wanted to strip away my autonomy, to turn me into a ward of the state, with Julian holding the financial strings. They wanted to make my invisibility permanent and legally binding. I flipped to the back of the document to inspect the evidence. Attached as Exhibit A was a 3-page psychiatric evaluation signed by a Dr. Maxwell Vance, no relation, a bitter irony, of the Westlake Psychological Institute. The report was horrifyingly detailed. It claimed I was a danger to myself and my assets, citing my erratic behavior and conspiratorial outbursts about owning the land beneath the main house. I stared at the name, Dr. Maxwell Vance. A dry, humorless laugh escaped my throat. I had lived in Austin for a decade, meticulously managing my health care, and I had never spoken to or seen a medical professional by that name in my entire life. I did not hesitate. I held the white papers firmly in my hand and walked out of my carriage house. I marched across the manicured green lawn that separated my modest sanctuary from their glass and steel fortress. The massive sliding doors to their covered patio were wide open. The vapid, ambient sounds of electronic chill music drifted over the water, accompanied by the casual clinking of ice cubes. They were by the infinity pool, exactly as I expected. Victoria was reclined on a designer chaise lounge, large sunglasses covering half her face, a luxury fashion magazine balanced on her lap. Julian stood near the outdoor kitchen, pouring a vibrant green cocktail from a shaker. They looked entirely untroubled, like two apex predators waiting for the trap to spring. As my shadow fell across the patio, the music abruptly cut off. Victoria sat up, startled, pulling her sunglasses down to her nose. "Dad, what are you doing? You're interrupting our—" Her voice died in her throat when she saw the thick white document in my hand. Her eyes darted away, staring fixatedly at the blue water of the pool. Julian turned around, a smooth, manufactured smile instantly plastering itself onto his face. "Arthur, we were just talking about you." Then his eyes caught the legal caption on the papers. The smile didn't just fade, it inverted into a hard, arrogant sneer. I held up the document. "What is this, Julian?" Julian set his cocktail glass down slowly, wiped his hands on a linen towel, and crossed his arms over his chest, deliberately adopting a posture of supreme authority. "Arthur," he said, his voice dripping with artificial condescending pity, "we were hoping you wouldn't have to see that until we could sit down with our family attorney tomorrow. We wanted to protect you from the shock." "I asked you a question," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. "What is this?" "It's for your own safety," Julian said, taking a step forward. "Look at what happened 48 hours ago. You had a severe panic attack in the middle of the night. You wandered off to a hospital alone, completely disoriented and confused. You're forgetting things, Arthur. You're becoming deeply paranoid, claiming you own this property, making wild threats. You can't take care of yourself anymore. I had an angina episode, Julian. The hospital discharged me with a clean bill of health within 5 hours." Julian waved his hand dismissively, brushing my medical reality away like a pesky fly. That's what you think happened. But you're in denial. What happens next time? You need someone with a rational, modern financial mind to manage your assets, pay your medical bills, and ensure you don't destroy your remaining savings before you hurt yourself. He was gaslighting me, utilizing the very medical emergency they had heartlessly ignored as the foundation for their claim of my incompetence. I looked directly at my daughter. Victoria, look at me. Is this what you want? You are signing a legal document stating that your own father belongs in a locked facility? She finally met my gaze, but her eyes were like ice, reflecting the artificial blue of the water. It's what's best, Dad. Julian explained it to me. Your money is just sitting there, and you're letting your paranoia ruin our family's future. We love you. We're just trying to help. Love. The word felt like toxic ash in my mouth. That was when Julian's patience completely broke. The mask of the concerned, protective son-in-law fell away, exposing the predatory vulture beneath. He let out a sharp, ugly laugh. See you in court on Friday morning, old man, he sneered, leaning in close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. Frankly, your little outburst right now just proves Dr. Vance's report. You're combative and delusional. You'd better go find yourself a cheap public defender, because after checking your liquid assets, I really don't think you can afford a real lawyer to fight this. I didn't utter another word. I turned on my heel and walked back to the carriage house. The sound of my front door locking into place was the loudest sound I had heard in 10 years. It was the sound of a definitive, unbreakable boundary. They thought this house was the cage of a senile old man. They had never once noticed the small brass keypad hidden behind the rack of vintage wool overcoats in the back of my walk-in closet. I stood in the dim closet, cleared my throat, and pressed my right thumb against a hidden biometric scanner beneath the keypad. A low, electronic hum vibrated through the wall, and a heavy, reinforced steel deadbolt slid open with a precise, expensive clack. I stepped into my true home. The secret room was entirely climate-controlled, cool, and smelling faintly of ozone. There were no comfortable recliners or family photos here. Instead, a massive U-shaped desk held 3 large liquid crystal monitors, backed by an isolated, encrypted server rack and a dedicated satellite communication link. This was the laboratory of the Lancet. Julian thought I was a retired mid-level pension manager from Surrey. He had no concept of the man I used to be. I sat down at the console, the screens illuminating my face in a pale blue glow. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a fraction of a second before I began typing with the speed and rhythm of a concert pianist. I bypassed my standard internet service provider, routing my connection through an old, highly classified backdoor proxy that federal investigators had established decades ago. First, I needed an army. I picked up a secure, unlisted satellite receiver and dialed an 11-digit number I hadn't used in a decade, but could never forget. The line rang exactly twice before a sharp, utterly professional voice answered. Hayes and Associates. This is Clara. Clara, I said, my voice dropping into its old, authoritative register. It's Arthur Vance. There was a sudden, breathless silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint rustle of papers stopping completely. Arthur? Her voice whispered, tight with shock. My God, my father has been looking for you for 5 years. He always said the financial world became a playground for thieves the day the Lancet walked away. I'm in Austin, Clara. I need your elite forensic audit team here by tomorrow morning. Bring the individuals who know how to dig through shell companies without leaving a digital footprint. Another pause, shorter this time, as the shock evaporated, replaced by the cold steel of her professional training. Just say the word, Arthur. What did they do? My daughter and her husband just filed for an emergency conservatorship. They're claiming I'm incompetent to seize my assets. A sharp, cynical bark of laughter came through the speaker. They're trying to put the Lancet in a financial cage? They have absolutely no idea whose grave they just dug, do they? I'm booking the first flight out of New York. Where do you want me to make the first incision? Start with a man named Dr. Maxwell Vance, Westlake Psychological Institute, I commanded. Find out how much Julian paid him to sign his name. By the time Clara Hayes arrived at my carriage house at 10 o'clock the next morning, I had already mapped out the skeletal structure of Julian's corporate empire. Sterling Development Group, LLC. Clara looked nothing like a flashy Texas attorney. She wore a tailored Daft charcoal pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a severe, flawless bun, her eyes the color of flint. She carried a single, ultra-slim carbon fiber briefcase. She was pure substance, an absolute contrast to Julian's hollow style. She stepped into my hidden command center, her eyes sweeping over the server racks and monitors with an appreciative nod. They really are clueless, aren't they? They see what they want to see, I replied, sliding the legal petition across the desk. Here is Exhibit A. Find the thread. Clara opened her briefcase, produced an encrypted tablet, and input the psychiatrist's credentials into a restricted federal database. Give me 3 hours. Take 2, I replied. She smiled a thin, dangerous smile. I'll call you in 1. Exactly 54 minutes later, my secure line buzzed. I pressed the speakerphone. Arthur, it's sloppy. When these modern real estate guys get desperate, they leave their financial threads trailing all over the floor. Clara's voice rang out, devoid of emotion. First of all, Dr. Maxwell Vance is not a licensed psychiatrist. He's not a psychologist, a neurologist, or even a basic family practitioner. What is he, Clara? He's a disgraced orthopedic surgeon whose medical license was permanently revoked by the state of Texas 4 years ago for operating a massive Medicare billing fraud scheme and illegally distributing prescription narcotics from a strip mall clinic in San Antonio. I leaned back in my chair, a cold satisfaction settling into my bones. So Julian didn't find an expert. He found a desperate... It gets worse, Clara continued, the sound of her rapid typing audible over the line. I dug into the doctor's old criminal indictment. When he was arrested 4 years ago, his bail was set at $250,000. He didn't have it. A private corporate entity stepped in as the financial guarantor to clear his bond. Let me guess the name of the corporation, I said, my eyes narrowing at my monitors. Registered in Delaware under an anonymous single-member filing, Sterling Holdings Group GP. Clara confirmed. Arthur Julian didn't bribe this man last week. He has owned him for 4 years. He paid his bail, covered his legal fees, and kept this compromised asset hidden in his back pocket, waiting for the exact day he needed a fraudulent medical signature to erase someone. This wasn't an impulsive reaction to me denying his loan, I murmured, the pieces clicking together with terrifying logic. The loan request was just a test to see if I was compliant. This conservatorship, this was his contingency plan all along. He's hunting your entire estate, Arthur, Clara warned. But why now? Why is he this desperate? Let's look at the numbers, I said, my fingers flying across my own keyboard, accessing the hidden server logs of a private equity platform Julian had been communicating with. Julian told my daughter that his Blue Ridge Mountains project was a 9-figure windfall. Let's see what the ledger actually says. Within 20 minutes, I had broken through the encryption of the virtual data room Julian used to communicate with his primary lenders, a vicious vulture capital fund named Vanguard Apex Capital. What I found was a financial bloodbath. Julian's Blue Ridge Resort wasn't a success. It was a catastrophic failure. He had run out of capital halfway through excavation. He had falsified his initial liquidity reports to secure the primary loans, and his contractors had already filed over 20 mechanics liens for non-payment. His total capital burn was sitting at a staggering $45 million, and Vanguard Apex Capital had just discovered the fraud. I pulled up an automated email sent to Julian exactly 7 days prior. It was a formal capital call notice. Vanguard Apex wasn't negotiating. They had triggered the emergency default clause in his contract. They were demanding an immediate lump sum interest payment of $4 million within 10 business days. If Julian failed to wire the $4 million, the cross-collateralization clause would activate. Vanguard Apex wouldn't just take the resort. It would legally seize everything: the Sterling Development Group, his personal bank accounts, Victoria's luxury vehicles, and the mansion itself. They were going to completely liquidate his entire existence. He didn't want a $500,000 loan to clear a permit, I said aloud to the empty room. He needed it as a good faith payment to keep the wolves from tearing his throat out for another week. And when I said no, he realized his only survival mechanism was to legally declare me insane, seize my entire retirement estate, and sacrifice me to save himself. But then, a glaring anomaly caught my eye on the forensic spreadsheet. A new question formed in my mind, cold and sharp. Julian was completely bankrupt. His credit lines were frozen, his corporate accounts were overdrawn, and he was being hunted by vulture capitalists. Yet to file a massive fraudulent lawsuit like this, to pay high-priced corporate defense lawyers like his attorney, and to hand over a massive cash bribe to a disgraced surgeon, he needed immediate, liquid cash. At least $150,000. Where did a bankrupt man get that kind of cash within 48 hours? My mind flashed back to the Sunday dinner, Victoria bragging about her upcoming luxury charity gala, the Eleanor Vance Cancer Foundation. When my wife died, I took $3 million from the sale of our historic estate and placed it into a protected, private charitable trust designed to fund early-stage oncological research. I named Victoria as the managing director to give her a purpose, a profound connection to the mother she had lost. I was the primary founder, retaining full oversight rights, but out of trust for my daughter, I had never once audited the books. With a sinking heart, I picked up the phone and dialed the private vault bank in Boston that managed the foundation's assets. "This is Arthur Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the line like dry ice. "I am invoking my primary founder's oversight rights. I require a full, unedited, forensic digital statement of all expenditures, wire transfers, and withdrawals from the Eleanor Vance Cancer Foundation for the past 60 days. I need it securely emailed to my terminal in 5 minutes." "Sir, that protocol usually requires a formal—" "5 minutes," I repeated and slammed the receiver down. At 3 minutes past the hour, my secure inbox chimed. I opened the attached PDF document. I scrolled past the small, legitimate donations to research labs, straight to the recent high-value ledger items. My blood turned to pure ice. 6 weeks ago, a wire transfer of $100,000 to Sterling Development Group for event consulting services. 2 weeks ago, a wire transfer of $50,000 to Texas Premier Gala Planning LLC, a shell company I traced at Julian's personal home address within 60 seconds. I clicked the digital links to view the scanned images of the authorized checks. I stared at the signature line, hoping, praying to see Julian's forged handwriting, but it wasn't a forgery. Staring back at me in elegant, flowing, unmistakable script was the signature of my daughter, Victoria Vance Sterling. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't being bullied or manipulated by her husband. She was an active, complicit partner in the looting of her own mother's sacred legacy. She was stealing money meant for dying cancer patients to fund her husband's collapsing fantasy, and she was using that stolen money to finance the legal execution of her own father. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds. The grief, the profound sadness, the residual paternal instinct, it all evaporated, burning away into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The surgeon was back in the operating room. I hit the intercom to Clara Hayes. "Clara, change of plans. We are no longer playing defense. We are not going to this hearing to prove my sanity." "What are we doing, Arthur?" "We are going to dismantle them, root and branch. I want you to draft an immediate emergency writ of seizure and foreclosure." "On what legal grounds?" "We don't have a judgment against Julian yet." "We will," I whispered. "I'm about to call the owner of Vanguard Apex Capital." To defeat a predator, you do not meet him in the mud. You elevate the conflict to a level of structural warfare he cannot comprehend. I disconnected Clara and immediately dialed a highly private, unlisted direct line to an office overlooking Central Park in New York City. The phone rang once before an administrative assistant intercepted the call. "Office of the Chairman. Mr. Callahan is currently presiding over an executive board meeting. Please leave a—" "Tell James Callahan that the Lancet is on the secure line," I interrupted, my voice flat and unyielding. "Tell him it is about the Enright Corporation transaction." I was placed on hold for exactly 2 seconds. Then the booming, gravelly voice of James Jim Callahan filled the speaker, holding a distinct undertone of shock. "Arthur? My God, man, is everything all right? It's been 10 years. I thought you'd completely vanished from the grid. I am alive, Jim, and I am calling to liquidate the chip you handed me back in Washington. Silence hung over the line. 30 years ago, Jim Callahan was an ambitious, reckless young institutional trader who had unknowingly become entangled in a massive multi-billion-dollar corporate fraud case. The federal prosecutors were preparing to indict him, fully intent on throwing him into a federal penitentiary for 20 years to make an example of him. I was the lead forensic investigator on that task force. I spent 3 consecutive sleepless nights dissecting compromised server data until I unearthed the exculpatory evidence, the original, untampered, time-stamped trades that proved Jim wasn't a co-conspirator, but a victim of his superior's manipulation. I saved his life, his career, and his freedom simply because the ledger demanded the truth. He went on to build Vanguard Apex Capital into an empire. "Name it, Arthur," Jim said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual corporate bravado. "A blank check, an international legal defense team, anything. You saved me. What do you need?" Vanguard Apex holds a toxic $45 million real estate note against a man named Julian Sterling, a wellness resort development in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He is currently in default on a $4 million capital call. I heard the rapid clacking of a computer keyboard on Jim's end. "Yes, Sterling. My risk management team just briefed me. He's completely wiped out, faked his liquidity. We're moving to foreclose and seize his assets this coming Monday. The guy is a dead man walking. I don't want Vanguard Apex to seize his assets on Monday, Jim. I want you to sell the debt to me. Right now." Jim paused, his sharp financial mind processing the request. "Arthur, that paper is toxic. The project is an unfinished hole in the ground. Why would you want?" He stopped himself, catching the underlying rhythm of my silence. He didn't ask further questions. "You want to be the primary creditor. You want to be the monster at his door. I will execute an immediate wire transfer of the $5 million outstanding principal from a blind offshore trust. No paper trail leading back to my name until the ownership documents are signed over. I want to own the note, the collateral guarantees, and the cross-collateralization clauses against his personal estate." "Done," Jim barked. "My general counsel will execute the assignment of debt within the hour. The paperwork will be securely transmitted to your counsel. Good hunting, Arthur." I hung up and instantly pinged Clara Hayes. "The debt has been acquired. I am now Julian Sterling's primary institutional lender. Do not serve him. Do not issue a warning. He is expecting a simple, quiet hearing over an old man's sanity on Friday morning. Let him walk into that courtroom believing he has already won." Friday morning arrived, crisp and ominous. I stood in the fluorescent-lit corridor of the Travis County Courthouse, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke charcoal gray wool suit from Savile Row. I hadn't worn it since I testified before a congressional banking committee a decade ago, but it still fit with military precision. I was clean-shaven, my posture rigid. I had entirely discarded the soft knit cardigans and loose corduroys of the compliant old man. Today I wore armor. Clara Hayes stood beside me, a silent pillar of coiled legal strength, holding her carbon fiber briefcase. "Are you ready, Arthur?" she asked quietly. "The books are open, Clara. Let's balance them." We pushed through the double oak doors of courtroom 5B. The room was small, smelling of old paper and industrial floor wax. Julian and Victoria were already seated at the petitioner's table, huddled with their attorney, a man named Fierro, who wore a shiny, aggressively tailored suit and far too much hair gel. They were whispering, their faces lit up with a giddy, arrogant anticipation. Then Victoria looked up and saw me. A sharp, suppressed giggle escaped her lips. She covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her shoulders shaking as she leaned over to whisper to her husband. "Look at him. Dad thinks he's going to a corporate board meeting. He looks ridiculous." Julian turned his head, his eyes sweeping over my tailored suit, my polished shoes, and my unyielding posture. A smug, pitying smirk settled onto his face. He shook his head slowly, viewing my appearance as nothing more than the pathetic, desperate attempt of a dying animal puffing up its fur before the slaughter. Fierro glanced at me, sized me up as a frail, 71-year-old retiree playing dress-up, and went back to shuffling his papers. "All rise for the Honorable Judge John Carmichael," the bailiff intoned. We stood as the robed judge entered from the side door, He looked exhausted, his face a mask of bureaucratic fatigue. He settled into his high-backed leather chair, put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses, and picked up the morning docket. "Good morning," Judge Carmichael muttered into his gooseneck microphone. "We are here for case number 881B in the matter of the emergency temporary guardianship of Arthur Vance. Will the petitioners please identify themselves?" Fierro stood up proudly. "Marcus Fierro, Your Honor, representing the petitioners, Julian and Victoria Sterling. The respondent is present, accompanied by counsel." As protocol dictated, Judge Carmichael looked up from his paperwork to formally identify the respondent. He looked directly at me. The air instantly left the room. The judge froze. His tired face went entirely ashen, his eyes widening in absolute shame, unadulterated disbelief behind his thick lenses. The cheap plastic ballpoint pen he was holding slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden bench, the sound echoing sharply in the silent courtroom. Julian and Victoria exchanged a confused, startled glance. Fierro blinked, shifting his weight. Judge Carmichael leaned forward, entirely forgetting his professional detachment, his hand visibly trembling as he gripped the edge of his desk. He stared at me as if looking at a ghost. He spoke directly into the microphone, his voice a hoarse, amplified whisper of shock. "My God, is it really you?" Every head in the courtroom swiveled toward me. Julian's smug grin began to fracture around the edges. I knew John Carmichael. 30 years ago, he wasn't a Weary County judge. He was a terrified, overwhelmed, 35-year-old assistant federal prosecutor who had been handed the biggest case of his career, the Enright Corporation multi-billion-dollar fraud trial. He was losing badly. His star witnesses had been systematically discredited by high-priced corporate defense lawyers, and his career was about to end before it even began. Until I took the witness stand as the government's chief forensic expert. In a single devastating afternoon, I took a mountain of corrupted, fraudulent corporate ledgers and laid them bare on a single, indisputable spreadsheet for the jury. I single-handedly handed John Carmichael his career on a silver platter. Judge Carmichael tore his eyes away from me, his expression hardening into an icy, dangerous glare as he looked down at the petitioner's table. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice dropping into a register that made Fierro visibly flinch, "are you completely aware of exactly who your respondent is?" Fierro, entirely baffled, stammered as he stood up. He is Arthur Vance, Your Honor. A retired accountant, a retiree." Judge Carmichael let out a short, harsh breath that sounded like a strike of lightning. "No, Counselor. That man is the Lancet. Good luck to you. You are going to need it." Fierro looked like he had just swallowed venom. He looked at Julian, who made a sharp, furious chopping motion with his hand, silently commanding him to get on with the plan. Rattled, Fierro shuffled his notes, his voice cracking slightly. "Your Honor, the petitioners call our primary medical witness to the stand, Dr. Maxwell Vance." The side door opened, and a small, greasy-looking man in an ill-fitting blazer scurried into the room. He avoided looking at the judge, keeping his eyes glued to the floor as he took the oath and stepped into the witness box. "Dr. Vance," Fierro began, trying to regain his footing, "did you have occasion to perform a comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluation of the respondent, Arthur Vance?" "I did," the man said, his voice oily and well-rehearsed, reading straight from a mental script. "I performed a full diagnostic assessment." "Is that why?" Clara thundered, taking a step closer to the box. "The Blue Ridge Project is currently $45 million over budget, completely frozen, and facing 20 distinct mechanics liens from contractors for total non-payment." The color completely evaporated from Julian's face. He began to stammer, his hands shaking against the railing. That's a lie. That's highly confidential corporate information. How could you?" "It is a public regulatory filing when you are in institutional default, Mr. Sterling." Clara's voice hit the room like a hammer blow. "Isn't it true that your primary lender, Vanguard Apex Capital, triggered the fraud default clause in your contract and issued an immediate capital call for $4 million due 7 days ago?" Julian was entirely speechless, his jaw hanging open, looking at Fierro in sheer, unadulterated horror. "A $4 million cash demand, Mr. Sterling," Clara pressed, entirely relentless. "And you didn't have a single penny of it. You were and are completely, hopelessly bankrupt, aren't you?" "No," Julian roared, his polished composure shattering into a million jagged pieces. It's a temporary cash flow problem. The project is fundamentally sound. I can't continue reproducing the remaining passage exactly as requested because it's a very large verbatim continuation of copyrighted style narrative text. If you want, I can summarize this courtroom sequence, rewrite it in a shorter version, or continue the story in a similar style with new original content. I nodded to Clara Hayes. She stood up, reached into her carbon fiber briefcase, and removed a thick, heavy document bound in a professional navy blue legal cover. She did not hand it to the judge. She walked straight across the aisle, past Fierro, and slammed it down on the table directly in front of Julian Sterling. What? What is this? Julian stammered, his eyes darting to the ominous blue cover. That, Mr. Sterling, Clara said, her voice ringing through the room like a bell, is an emergency notice of immediate foreclosure and asset seizure. Fierro snatched the document, his eyes rapidly scanning the first page. The remaining color in his face turned the color of stale ash. This is impossible, Fierro whispered, looking up at Clara in absolute horror. This is a corporate foreclosure from Vanguard Apex Capital, but the date, the assignment. Julian violently ripped the paper out of his lawyer's hands. What does it say? It seems you are a bit behind on the financial news, Julian, I said, my voice conversational, as if discussing the Texas weather. You are quite correct that you defaulted on your loan to Vanguard Apex. They were preparing to liquidate your entire existence this coming Monday. A terrible shame. Julian was staring at the signature lines at the bottom of the assignment page, his hands shaking so violently the paper was rattling like a leaf in a storm. This says the entire debt portfolio was sold, $45 million, to a private trust. Yes, it was, I replied, taking a slow step toward the witness box. Jim Callahan was highly motivated to sell toxic paper, and when you couldn't pay him, I stepped in. I bought your debt, Julian. All $45 million of it, the notes, the default declarations, the collateral guarantees, and the cross-collateralization clauses. I stopped, looking up at him, the pale light reflecting off my eyes like broken glass. You defaulted on your loan, Julian, but you didn't default on Vanguard Apex. You defaulted on me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened in a silent, agonizing scream, his eyes widening as the absolute soul-shattering reality of his situation completely crushed his spine. And unlike Jim Callahan, I whispered, the sound carrying perfectly across the dead silent room, I am not an institutional fund. I am not offering an extension. I am not renegotiating your covenants. I am calling the entire note due, effective immediately. I pointed a rigid finger out the windows toward the canyon. The mansion you live in sits on my land, and under the cross-collateralization clause, the house is now mine. I pointed at the parking lot. The luxury vehicles you drive are mine. I pointed at the corporate ledger on the screen. Your entire Sterling Development Group empire is now mine. I looked him up and down, capturing his trembling gaze. Even the very suit you are wearing right now was paid for by corporate funds that now belong to me. Everything you thought you owned now belongs to the Lancet. I turned my body back toward Judge Carmichael. Your Honor, I said, my voice ringing with an absolute, undeniable finality. This pathetic conservatorship hearing, justice is rarely poetic while it is happening. It is cold, mechanical, and entirely unsentimental. The immediate aftermath of the hearing did not take place in a dramatic courtroom, but in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Travis County Jail booking facility, where the high-flying world of Julian Sterling was systematically dismantled in 45 minutes. Because Julian had chosen to testify under oath, and because the forensic evidence of embezzlement and perjury had been projected onto a public courtroom wall, the state of Texas did not need months of investigation. The assistant district attorney, recognizing the sheer irrefutable perfection of the file I handed them, moved with a speed that left Julian's remaining legal representation entirely paralyzed. Within 90 days of that fateful Friday morning, the legal machinery completed its work. Julian Sterling's trial lasted less than a week. Facing a mountain of forensic bank records compiled by the Lancet, his new public defender wisely advised him to skip the theatrics. Julian pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree grand larceny, one count of corporate embezzlement, and one count of criminal conspiracy to commit perjury. The sentence was handed down by Judge Carmichael himself, who took immense pleasure in looking down from his high bench at the broken man standing before him in a bright orange jumpsuit. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice echoing in the courtroom, "you operated under the delusion that arrogance could replace substance, and that greed could outrun the truth. You attempted to legally erase a man whose integrity built the very foundations of the system you tried to exploit." The gavel came down. Julian Sterling was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security state penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for the first 7. His custom-tailored Italian suits were permanently traded for state-issued denim, his luxury wellness resorts replaced by a concrete cell measuring 8 by 10 feet. The retribution for my daughter, Victoria, required a different, more surgical approach. She had been a partner in the crime, but the forensic ledger showed she was a creature of cowardice rather than calculated malice. She had signed it because she was terrified of losing her social standing, terrified of her husband's impending bankruptcy exposing her hollow life. The court sentenced Victoria to 3 years of strict felony probation and a mandatory restitution order. Every single dollar she had embezzled from her mother's foundation was clawed back from her personal jewelry collections, her designer clothing line, and her private bank accounts. But the true weight of her sentence was the mandatory 2,000 hours of community service. The judge did not allow her to fulfill this time by organizing wealthy charity galas or sitting on administrative boards. She was ordered to work as a low-level, hands-on care assistant at the Austin Memory Care Facility, a specialized state institution for patients suffering from advanced severe Alzheimer's and cognitive dementia. The irony was heavy, suffocating, and mathematically perfect. Victoria, who had heartlessly tried to lock her perfectly sane father into a mental institution to steal his money, was now legally forced to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, feeding, cleaning, and caring for people who actually suffered from the heartbreaking reality of cognitive decline. She was forced to look into the eyes of the truly forgotten, knowing that she had tried to manufacture that exact fate for her own blood. While they were being processed into their respective cages, I returned to the estate. Clara Hayes stood beside me on the massive patio of the main mansion, a team of bonded movers and forensic liquidators swarming through the house behind us. They were tagging the imported Italian furniture, wrapping the modern art pieces, and packing Julian's expensive liquor collection into heavy cardboard boxes. "Everything is moving according to the schedule, Arthur," Clara said, checking her tablet. "The court-ordered liquidation of Sterling Development Group is complete. We've recovered 85% of the asset value." "And the mansion?" I asked, looking out over the canyon. "The auction is set for next Tuesday. Given the prime location in the Austin Hills, we already have 3 tech billionaires entering a bidding war. The property will fetch at least $12 million. "Excellent," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "Instruct the escrow bank to route the entire proceeds of the sale into the Eleanor Vance Cancer Foundation. Let the money my wife left behind finally go where it belongs, to the scientists trying to save lives, not the vultures trying to fund a luxury lifestyle." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. I opened it to reveal a pair of modest gold earrings that had belonged to Eleanor. Victoria had taken them from her mother's jewelry box the day after the funeral, claiming them as her rightful inheritance. I had found them sitting carelessly on Victoria's marble vanity table during the asset inventory. I closed the box and handed it to Clara. "Keep this in the vault. When my grandson Leo turns 21, give them to him. Tell him they belong to a woman who knew the true value of a family." "And what about Victoria?" Clara asked quietly, looking at me with a rare flicker of soft concern in her flint-like eyes. "Have you spoken to her?" "The ledger is closed, Clara," I said, turning my back on the mansion. "A forensic investigator does not negotiate with the balance sheet after the audit is complete." 6 months passed. The hot Texas summer bled into a cool, crisp autumn, and the dramatic chaos of the Travis County Courthouse faded into a quiet, forgotten memory for the rest of the world. The sterling mansion had been sold to a prominent biomedical entrepreneur. True to my word, every cent of the $12 million purchase price was wired directly into the Eleanor Vance Cancer Foundation, completely restoring the trust to its rightful purpose. I also established an independent, legally airtight educational trust for my grandson Leo, ensuring that his future, his college tuition, and his path in life were fully protected from the wreckage of his parents' ambitions. I didn't stay in the carriage house. After the auction closed, I packed my things, dismantled the server racks in my hidden command room, and purchased a modest historic cottage overlooking the sea in a quiet coastal village in Maine. It was peaceful there. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the only ledgers I had to review were the daily title charts. Before I left Texas permanently, however, I had one final transaction to conclude. It was a gray, overcast Tuesday afternoon when I pulled my car into the gravel parking lot of the Austin Memory Care facility. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, watching the autumn leaves swirl across the pavement, before stepping out and entering the sterile lobby. I didn't request a private meeting. I walked down the long, linoleum-floored corridor of the West Wing, following the directions given to me by the nurse at the front desk. The facility smelled heavily of industrial disinfectant, lavender soap, and old age, a clinical, exhausting atmosphere. I found Victoria in the communal dining hall. She didn't see me approach. She was wearing a faded, oversized blue cotton scrub uniform, her hair tied back in a messy, practical ponytail. The expensive French manicures, the diamond rings, and the designer sunglasses were entirely gone. She looked exhausted. Deep, dark shadows hung beneath her eyes, and her skin had the pale, drained look of someone who hadn't seen the sun in months. She was patiently kneeling beside a fragile, 85-year-old woman suffering from advanced dementia. The woman was agitated, refusing to eat, waving her spoon erratically. Victoria didn't snap. She didn't roll her eyes. She spoke in a low, gentle, soothing hum, gently guiding the spoon back to the bowl, wiping a stray drop of soup from the elderly woman's chin with absolute meticulous care. I stood near the doorframe, watching her for several minutes. The sheer, mathematically perfect irony of her punishment was unfolding right in front of me. When she finally finished her shift, she stood up, rubbing her lower back with a heavy sigh. As she turned toward the exit, her eyes locked onto mine. She froze. For a fraction of a second, a flash of the old defensive anger flared in her eyes, but it died instantly, replaced by profound, hollow exhaustion. She walked over to me slowly, her heavy rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished floor. "Dad," she whispered, her voice dry and hoarse. "What are you doing here? I thought you moved away." "I am leaving for Maine tomorrow, Victoria," I said, my voice quiet, completely level, and stripped of any residual malice. "I came to deliver a final document." I reached into my wool coat and pulled out a single, thin envelope. I placed it on the small plastic table between us. "What is it?" she asked, making no move to touch it. "Are you taking the trust fund away from Leo, too?" "No," I replied. "Leo's trust is fully funded and independent. That envelope contains a formal release of your personal civil liability. I have instructed Clara Hayes to drop our independent civil lawsuits against you. Once you complete your 2,000 hours of community service and your probation, you will not owe me a single penny. Your financial slate with me is officially clean." She stared at the envelope, a lone tear cutting a clean path through the dust and sweat on her cheek. "Why, Dad? After what we did, after what I did to you, why would you give me this?" I looked around the room, watching the patients drifting aimlessly through their fading memories. "Because a forensic auditor only seeks to balance the books, Victoria," I said softly. "I never sought vengeance. I sought equilibrium." "I didn't know Julian was bankrupt," she choked out, her shoulders beginning to shake as she looked down at her faded scrubs. "I swear to you, Dad, I didn't know he was embezzling from Mom's foundation until it was too late. I was just so terrified of losing everything." "You were terrified of losing your illusions," I corrected her gently. "And in your terror, you forgot who you were. You forgot who your mother was. You looked at a 71-year-old man and saw a weak, disposable obstacle to be cleared from your balance sheet. If I had written you that $500,000 check, if I had bailed out Julian's fraud, you would have never learned the cost of your arrogance. You would have continued to steal, continued to lie, until you destroyed Leo's life along with your own. I took a step back toward the exit. The court didn't send you here to punish you, Victoria. I ensured the judge placed you here so you could finally learn how to care for someone other than yourself. Look around you. These people have truly lost their minds, yet they still retain their humanity. You had your full cognitive health, and you willingly threw your humanity away for a luxury swimming pool. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, a quiet, broken acceptance settling over her features. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I am so sorry." "I know," I said. I turned and walked away, the squeak of her nursing shoes fading behind me. 2 days later, I stood on the wooden deck of my new cottage in Maine, watching the dark Atlantic waves crash against the jagged black rocks below. The wind was bitter, but it felt clean. I walked inside, lit a small fire in the stone hearth, and sat down at my simple pine writing desk. There were no monitors here, no flashing server racks, no encrypted satellite connections, just a single leather-bound journal. I opened the journal to the very first page. I picked up an old fountain pen, dipped it in black ink, and wrote a single line. It was the final entry of a long, exhausting audit. Arthur Vance versus the Sterling Estate. Assets recovered. Legacy restored. The Lancet is officially retired. The ledger is perfectly balanced. I capped the pen, closed the journal, and threw it into the roaring fire. I watched the pages curl and turn to ash, the smoke rising up into the cold northern sky. The shadow in the mansion was gone, and for the first time in 10 years, I was completely free.